I organize a conference with my coworkers in Columbus every year, and it's 3 days long, and it seems like we plan for it all year, and it's a lot of work when we do it. We love it, but we're very tired on Monday when it's over, and how you have the stamina to do this for 10 days is actually pretty remarkable, so thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. So you guys got to see food choices, yes? Did you like it? Terrific. I'm glad. We're in the top 10 on every platform I think we are playing on right now, so that's all good. Yeah, it tells you there is a great appetite for this information. So some of you might have attended the panel discussion last night, and one of the things we talked about is this idea gaining traction. What does it take for this idea to gain traction? And I think we have evidence that it is gaining traction. You think about the number of books and documentaries and resources that have been made available, and they're doing well. They're all doing well, and that's so exciting. It's very exciting. So one other thing I want to mention is that Steve was mentioning that Food Over Medicine is written in a conversational style, and that was my co-author's idea. He's a marvelous writer, and he approached me with the idea of writing the book. The book was actually his idea, and he said, I think we could cover really complicated topics if we did it conversational style because it wouldn't seem so dry. I said, are you saying that what I write is dry? He says, well, you're a tiny bit academic, I'm just saying, so. But he was right about that. The conversational style did allow us to tackle a lot of things that I think we might not have otherwise tackled. And so today's lecture is based on the concept that food is medicine. I tell people all the time, when you walk into the grocery store, you stand in the produce department, you are at the pharmacy. And we have a class of drugs called cruciferous vegetables, all right? We have a class of drugs called stone fruits. We have a class of drugs called leafy greens. And what you want to do is make sure that you take some of each of the classes of drugs home with you, and you will do well. And I thought what we would do today is we would talk about diabetes a little bit because it is so common. And then I want to venture off into some conditions that we don't often talk about, like multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's disease, Crohn's and colitis, because while we don't have as many, thankfully, Crohn's and colitis patients as we do diabetics, if you add up all the other diseases, we're talking about a significant percentage of the country that is sick today. So the right diet can save your life. And I want to talk about first genetics. This came up a little bit last night, but we are going to start with the discussion of genetics. And the good news is that your genes do not determine your health outcomes. It's not that they don't make a difference. Everybody in this room is genetically predisposed to develop a disease or 2 or 5. You've heard before, diabetes runs in my family. Heart disease runs in my family. You know what else runs in families? Eating habits. Yeah. And, in my family, for example, the women on my mother's side of the family, they all got rheumatoid arthritis. And by the way, all the women on my mother's side of the family are and were overweight. If there's an obesity gene, I've got it going on, seriously. I'm the first normal weight woman in my family ever on my mother's side. Now, having said that, how many people think by now you've determined I'm an overachiever? Anybody? Okay. So if I decided to eat my way into obesity and rheumatoid arthritis, I'm pretty sure I could do it by next spring. All I would have to do is start eating the diet that my mother ate and some other of my relatives ate, and I, too, could turn on the genes for rheumatoid arthritis and obesity. But I'm choosing not to do that. The diseases we're suffering from are actually not genetically induced. They're foodborne illnesses. We think about foodborne illness, you think about E. coli. Well, I have news for you. Diabetes is a foodborne illness. You eat your way in, and you can eat your way out. Now, how do we know that that's true? One way that we know is what are called migration studies. And what this means is that you take a population of people who live in a place where the disease rate is pretty low, and they move to a place where the disease rate is different. And when people come from those places, for example, to the United States, within 15 years, it used to take a generation, now it's been backed up to just 15 years, the people duplicate and have our obesity and disease rates. Now let's take an example. When Japanese people move here to the United States, do you think that they get halfway over the Pacific Ocean and there's some switch in their genes? No, they land in San Francisco and they head to Starbucks and McDonald's and some of the places that people who have diseases hang out, and they adopt our diet. So that's one way that we know. Another thing is studies of identical twins continuously show that in most instances, difference in diet and lifestyle patterns lead to differences in health outcomes. And then another clue is you've heard from at this conference a lot of doctors who are using diet as an intervention tool. You heard Dr. Montgomery talking about this last night. And these doctors will all report that there's no difference in how the patients respond. It's not based on their ethnicity. It's not based on their genetic profile or whether or not these diseases run in their family. It's based on compliance on the diet. Now, this is an example I like to use because it's just so crystal clear. The Pima Indians, there are two groups of Pima Indians. One lives in Mexico and one lives in Arizona, and some of them are even members of the same immediate family. But their diets and lifestyles are quite different, as you might imagine. The Mexican Pima are very physically active people, and they eat a grain, fruit, vegetable-based diet, while the Arizona Pima eat a diet high in animal protein and fat, and they're not quite as physically active. And look at the striking difference in the statistics. The Mexican Pima, the diabetes rate is 6.9%, and for the Arizona Pima, it's 38%. Okay, so you're talking about pretty identical genetic predisposition, but widely divergent diets producing widely divergent results. And we could go through I have a lot of charts that I use in some of the classes I teach where we show like sibling disease concordance. And about the highest you ever find is psoriasis at 17%. The rest of it's quite a bit lower. Now, this is a chart that I think makes this diet issue really crystal clear. The original research, this is my original research, by the way, and the original charts had 60 countries, but that makes for a very tiny slide that none of you'd be able to interpret from here. So we use this chart in Forks Over Knives, and what I did to develop this is I contacted the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations based in Italy, and I was able to get the food production rates in 60 different countries. That's what we were looking for. And food production mirrors food intake. In other words, what farmers produce in a country is usually pretty closely related to what people will eat. And just to let you know what this project involved, when we got it, it wasn't all packaged up like this. We got it, these charts went on for days and days because it had every vegetable and it had every fruit and every seed. We had to add all this stuff up. I had interns in the office that spent time on this. Then we managed to do some matching with the World Health Organization and look at the death rates from heart disease and cancer in those same 60 countries and match them up. And so if you look here, you'll see that in Uganda, the percentage of calories from animal foods is really low at 6.4%, and you end up with a little over 49 per 100,000 cancer death rate and 128 point something per 100,000 for heart disease. You'll see what happens it's not a straight line, by the way, and it never is, but you'll see what happens as the amount of animal food increases, that death rate from heart disease and cancer goes up quite a bit. And if you'll see down here, our carnivorous Hungarians eating 30.7% of calories from animal food, and we're up to 328.5 per 100,000 on cancer mortality versus 49.4 per 100,000. That's a big difference. And look at the difference over here on, these are little things for me to see from the distance, 651.3 versus 128.8 per 100,000. I mean, it just doesn't get any more clear than this. And I'll never forget the day that we started putting the graph together for the 60 countries. And like I said, you never get a straight line, and you don't know what you're getting into when you get piles and piles of data from these organizations. But as we were plotting the countries, the picture, so we've got 20 countries in, and we're all smiling at each other and high-fiving because this thing was showing clearly the more animal food you eat, the worse it gets, and we could probably do that for every disease. But after we spent 60 hours, 4 of us doing this, we didn't think we wanted to do it for any more diseases. So this is it, this is all you get. But I think it's pretty clear. All right, so conditions that respond to dietary change. Most of them that are chronic and degenerative. And this came up in one of the talks yesterday. You know, if you're in a car accident and you have a broken leg, reading the China study and eating a baked potato is not going to fix your problem. But if you have acne, if you have arthritis and chronic sinus infections and kidney stones and neuropathy and all the chronic degenerative conditions that really constitute most of what our healthcare bills are for, you're going to see a difference based on diet, both in incidence rate and also in the ability to stop the progression of and even reverse. Now, let's talk about diabetes first, and I'll share some information with you. Again, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on this because the diabetes rate in this country is so high, and it's increasing in other countries too. The last time I looked, the number of diabetics in Shanghai, China was 1.2 million. Can you imagine having over 1 million diabetics in one city? Of course, it's a big city with a big population, but if the Chinese population continues to experience this growing disease rate, they have no capacity financially to deal with this. This is a problem that doesn't just affect us, it affects people all over the world. So the standard American diet, you guys know, it's comprised of calorie-dense animal foods, high in fat. Weight gain increases the risk of type 2 diabetes, and one way to gain weight is to eat calorie-dense, high-fat food. Another thing is animal foods contain heme iron, and a lot of people don't realize this, but higher heme iron levels increase insulin resistance. Higher intake of heme iron. So that's one of the ways that people think that the problem is potatoes. I got to tell you something, the problem is not potatoes for diabetes, the problem is steak, the problem is cheese. That's what's going to increase your risk of diabetes, but particularly red meat and the high heme iron content. A study comparing a relationship between insulin resistance and iron intake, the lacto-ovo vegetarians showed vegetarians are more insulin sensitive than lacto-ovo vegetarians and meat eaters. And you see this, again, you can look at a map of the world and see where people are eating a plant-based diet. You see low incidence of type 2 diabetes. Eating a meat-based diet, you see a higher incidence of type 2 diabetes. Now, let's talk about type 1 diabetes for a minute. And the type 1 diabetes, one of the causes of it is related to something called molecular mimicry. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this term, but molecular mimicry means that the amino acid chains that make up one protein resemble the amino acid chains that make up another protein. And so if you take a look at these food proteins, for example, I'm going to show you how this happens. Partially digested food proteins get into the bloodstream. The body does exactly what it's supposed to do, creates antibodies to those food proteins, and then if there are proteins in the body, tissues in the body, where the amino acid chains that make up those tissues look similar, those antibodies will go after those body parts. It's the body attacking itself with its own immune system. So how this happens in some children is cow's milk is designed to help a baby cow grow into a full-grown cow in a pretty short period of time. It was never designed for human intake. Some kids don't digest milk very well. We all don't digest it very well after weaning, but some kids, little kids, don't digest milk well. Another confounding factor is a condition called leaky gut, which a lot of children have because they are treated with antibiotics so much due to ear infections and that sort of thing. And so children develop a leaky gut as the beneficial bacteria in their guts is killed off as a result of the antibiotics. And so these partially digested milk proteins get into the bloodstream. The body creates antibodies to attack those foreign invaders. These little fragments of milk protein, the amino acid chains look a lot like the amino acid chains that make up the beta cells that produce insulin in the pancreas. And the antibodies begin attacking those beta cells, and if enough of them are killed off, you end up with a type 1 diabetic. Now, how do we know that this is true? Well, in 1992, a study was done where blood samples were taken from children who have had type 1 diabetes and children who didn't. And what they found is 100% of the children with type 1 diabetes had antibodies to cow's milk proteins, and none of the children in the control group without diabetes had those antibodies. And several studies have confirmed that. I've listed 3 of them here. So we get a pretty consistent result. Now, this doesn't mean, obviously, that all children who consume cow's milk develop type 1 diabetes, but their risk is higher. In fact, one study showed that genetically susceptible children who consume cow's milk have an 11.3 times greater risk of developing juvenile diabetes, and that's higher than the risk that a smoker will develop lung cancer. Now, we said this before, we spend a lot of money teaching people, trying to prevent people from smoking, trying to get them to quit if they've already taken up the habit, and I think that's a very good idea. Smoking is not good for your health. And then we spend a lot of money promoting cow's milk intake in this country, which leads to just as many problems of a different sort, but just as many problems. And guess who pays the bill for this? The taxpayers are burdened with a lot of the cost of this. So our public policies are almost incoherent as it pertains to health in this country. Now, we did this a little bit with heart disease yesterday, coronary artery disease, and I just want to focus on this, that diabetes medications are approved because they control glucose levels, not because they actually improve health outcomes for diabetics. And so in one study, a drug was found to reduce A1C levels by 1.5%, reduce fasting glucose by 75 milligrams per deciliter, and reduce insulin resistance by 25%. Boy, if you're a type 2 diabetic, you might say, sign me up for that. Sounds like it's great. Here's the problem. An analysis of 40 studies, including 28,000 patients, showed that the patients taking the drug had more heart attacks, 39% more strokes, 20% more deaths from cardiovascular disease. So again, we see this phenomenon that only could happen in a place like America where we innovate. We have dead people with great blood work here, and I don't think that's the objective. Don't think that's what we're trying to do. Studies continue to show that the more aggressively you medicate diabetics, the worse you make things for many of them. You increase the heart attack risk, the stroke risk, the death rate. And so this doesn't mean that no diabetics should be medicated. It means that, and it goes to some of the discussion we had last night, how do you get people to do this? You've got to show them the consequences of the various choices that they make. When people understand consequences, they can make informed decisions. If they don't, they often make foolish decisions and then later on regret what they did. Here you see studies that have been stopped early. This is an increasing thing that's happening, is that some studies are being stopped early because it becomes apparent that medicating the patients in the intervention group is producing worse results than patients who receive less medication or no medication. This was the Veterans Affairs Diabetes Trial, 1,795 military veterans. Patients received either intensive or standard therapy. And again, we see that the outcomes were far worse for the patients who were heavily medicated. And so the point that I'm trying to make is that it's a good idea for diabetics to have low glucose levels, because once they achieve that, they're actually former diabetics if they achieve it through dietary change rather than drugging. Because when you drug a diabetic and ratchet those numbers down as low as you possibly can, you get pretty blood work, but you start bumping off a significant portion of the population you're treating. And I'm just astounded that people aren't screaming and hollering about this more. You know, the objective of healthcare is not to kill some of the patients. The objective is, seriously, we're supposed to, and the other thing too, is then the studies results sometimes say, well, the standard therapy is better because it doesn't hurt as many people. I don't think the objective of healthcare is to hurt less people. We'll do this treatment because it's less harmful. How about we do something that's not harmful? You know, I am unaware of any deleterious side effects from eating broccoli and sweet potatoes. I mean, really, we should be, I don't know that we need to do a whole lot more research on this. What do we have to lose by taking people who have outcomes like this and putting them on a plant-based diet? Now, one of the biggest misunderstandings of the diabetes business is, and you hear this all the time, carbohydrates are the problem. You got to be very careful about eating carbohydrate foods. Aren't you better off on a paleo diet because meat-based and all that sort of thing? But actually, the problem with diabetes is that diabetics, and some of it is their genetic predisposition, are very good at storing fat in their cells. Now, we're all aware of what happens when we store fat on our bodies. We end up with, as Dr. Clapper said, bigger derrieres last night. All right, that's storing the fat on our bodies, but the fat gets inside the cells too. And so, study with young adults who didn't have diabetes but were genetically prone. Some were insulin resistant, their muscle cells had a buildup of fat, and as intracellular fat accumulates, when these people eat fat, what happens is the cells become increasingly insulin resistant, and at some point in time, you end up with a full-blown diabetic. And this is one of the reasons why somebody can be still lean and be diabetic. It is true that being obese, being overweight and obese is a big risk factor, but you can actually be lean and still be diabetic, be quite adept at storing fat. We call it intracellular fat because we like to make up big names. It makes us sound like we know what we're doing in healthcare. Okay, so people with type 2 diabetes have fewer mitochondria, and the number of mitochondria are affected by diet. And so researchers put 10 young men on a diet with 50% of calories from fat. Within 3 days, their intracellular fat increased, and the genes that were responsible for mitochondria production were disabled. 3 days. Now, people don't eat a bad diet in our country for 3 days. They eat a bad diet in our country for 75 years, right? So think about the cumulative effect. And then, as was mentioned last night, if you look in the medical textbooks, the number one cause of disease in the medical textbook, etiology unknown. We have no idea. It's like you have just bad luck one day. You're walking down the street and you get diabetes. That's actually not how it happens. And it's such a disempowering concept anyway, to make people feel like you're a helpless victim because of your genes or because you happen to have bad luck. Traditional diabetes diets, I think the most important thing to mention, they're terrible. They make the diabetic worse over time. But I think what's most amazing is if you take a look at the diet that is recommended by the American Diabetes Association, few people stick with it, nobody gets well. And the diet in places where people do not get diabetes is nothing like the American diabetes diet. Now, I used to be in business. My background was sales training. I don't know if you know this. I was the oldest person on the planet to graduate from naturopathy school. This is a midlife transition for me. So I was in sales training, and one of the things I used to teach in sales training is to be successful at something. You find people who are successful at that thing you want to do, and then you emulate their behavior, all right? So if I was going to get in the real estate business, we have a member at Wellness Farm Health, and after her kids got into school, she got into real estate, and she has one of the biggest real estate businesses in the country. She's one of the top 100 realtors in the United States of America. So if I was going to get into real estate, I'd call this woman, take her out to lunch, and find out what she knows, and then I would go do that, all right? This is amazing to me that we look around the world and look at the diets that people have who don't get diabetes, and we recommend something else entirely. Better options. This is a study I like to use because it involved type 1 and type 2 diabetics who were placed on, they were all insulin, all 50 diabetics were insulin dependent. Type 1s, of course, always are, but they were placed on a whole foods plant-based diet, and in 21 days, what happened is the type 1 diabetics were able to reduce their insulin by 40% and their cholesterol dropped 30%. 21 days. 24 out of 25 type 2 diabetics were off their insulin in 21 days. All right, now, you're not going to cure type 1 diabetics, but I'll tell you what you can do, and this study has proved. You can improve their outcomes incredibly. You can be assured that they are help to increase the odds that they'll live their full lifespan, that they will die with all of their body parts. I mean, the leading cause of amputation in this country is diabetes. More diabetics have limbs amputated than war vets, if that gives you an idea, all right? So the leading cause of blindness is diabetic retinopathy, 250 times higher risk of stroke, high risk of kidney failure. When you reduce the risk of all those comorbidities, you're doing a type 1 diabetic a favor, even though you cannot cure the disease. The type 2s, They're on their way to becoming not diabetic. And this astounds people still. I remember at a Q&A after Forks Over Knives, and this woman said, "You mean I can get rid of my diabetes?" I said, if you want to. I mean, if you're really attached to it, you want to hang on to it, that's your choice. But if you would like to get rid of it, that actually is an option. Dr. Neil Barnard, a colleague of mine and the founder of the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, in a pilot study, no limit on carbohydrate intake or food intake, focuses on lowering fat, no animal foods, no change in physical activity. At the end of 12 weeks, 15 pounds lost, fasting blood glucose dropped 28%. 2/3 of the patients reduced or eliminated their medications. Okay. Study with female patients who were moderately overweight and with not yet diabetic, eliminated animal foods, reduced oils. The control group did the regular thing. After 14 weeks, the vegetarian group lost 13 pounds, the controls far less. But here's the point, the vegetarians, their insulin sensitivity improved in that period of time. And we're talking about short periods of time. You know, sometimes it's hard to get the medication doses right in just a few weeks for diabetics. And what you see is their health improving in just a few weeks in these kinds of studies. Dr. Barnard has continued to do research on diabetics and diet and continues to show the same results. And by the way, replicability is important in research. The ability to have different researchers doing different projects funded by different organizations and arriving at the same results, that's very important. And you see a lot of that in this field. And in fact, I don't have data to make slides from it yet, but when I was at the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine's conference this summer, they were presenting some data on the Native American populations, back to our Pima Indian friends. PCRM's been going into the reservations and taking people who are genetically predisposed to develop diabetes and reversing it. And they even had a guy there who used to weigh 400 pounds, down to normal weight, diabetes gone, who got up and told his story. So pretty amazing stuff. This is an interesting study. 8 patients in Rome had gastric bypass surgery, and of course they lost weight in the first 6 months. I'm not showing you this because I recommend that course of action, but their intracellular fat dropped by 87%, and their insulin resistance was resolved even though they were still morbidly obese. That's why they had the surgery in the first place. And we consistently see that when you put people on a low-fat, whole foods, plant-based diet, all that fat comes pouring out of the cells, and the cells become more insulin sensitive, and that's how you get rid of the type 2 diabetes. So, diabetics should eat carbs. Animal foods increase insulin resistance, not potatoes. And I'll say this too, people think that the paleo diet's great, and you heard people say last night, people like to hear good news about their bad habits, so you can eat all the ox and moose that you want on the paleo diet, I guess. I don't know where you find those foods, but in any case, you can have all those foods that you want. But once in a while, somebody will come up to me at Wellness Forum Health and throw their arms around me and hug me, and I'll say, I'm so glad you're happy. They say, Dr. Pam, you have no idea. I want a potato so bad I can taste it. Because after living on animal foods, people think it's great to eat all this animal food until you do it for a while. And then it's not so much fun. And in fact, I don't know if you guys know this, but Dr. Barnard did some studies on Dr. Ornish's patients a long time ago. And it was back when Dr. Ornish was starting to publish the results of his heart disease study. And it was very clear the people eating the plant-based diet were reversing their disease and not having more heart attacks and all that sort of thing. But you know how the chatter in the medical community, it's so hard, nobody will do it. So Dr. Barnard decided to interview Dr. Ornish's patients, and he published this data. And when he interviewed the people who had adopted the plant-based diet, their stories were very similar, and what they basically said is, in the beginning it was unfamiliar, it was kind of hard, I had to get used to it, I wasn't used to the foods, but then it settled in, pretty much I'm happy with it, yeah, I'm going to stick with it, and all that sort of thing. And then he interviewed the people who were on the diet that's supposedly so much better, because it's not so restrictive, and the story with those people was pretty consistent. Oh my gosh, I'm so tired of eating chicken and fish and more chicken and fish. All you eat on this diet is chicken and fish, and I'm sick of it. And so the perception that people had, which was that the people eating the plant-based diet were unhappy, and the people eating the American Heart Association's diet that's far more liberal were whooping it up thinking, aren't we the lucky people? They weren't all that happy with their diet. So, and that's a common thing that we hear in our office once people make this conversion, is they'll say, when I came to see you, I was ready to do anything, including eating grass in the front yard, if that's what you told me. But frankly, I was a little concerned about this because I thought that you lived on tree bark and pine cones, and I was going to have to do that too. And so I'm surprised. I like the food as much as I do, and I'm also surprised at how easy this really is to do. It's kind of a non-issue once I got started. So let's talk a little bit about multiple sclerosis, which is an intractable disease. And the guy who really did a lot of research, I think we're all sort of walking in his shoes, those of us who are helping MS patients, was Dr. Roy Swank. And he did a lot of observation and research to arrive at the conclusion that the problem with multiple sclerosis patients was high-fat, high-animal food. So he conducted his initial trial on 144 patients, and he followed them for 34 years. And by the way, I talked a little bit about Esselstyn following his patients for 30 years. Here you've got Swank for 34 years. And so people bring me data, some of it kind of questionable. They did a diet trial showing the people on the paleo diet were doing great at 60 days. And I tell them, well, come back in 34 years. All right, I'm interested in seeing what happens then. But patients were placed on a low saturated fat diet. They were to eat only 1 to 15 grams a day, and that's a whole lot more than what we're giving MS patients now, but at the time that was pretty radical. And what happened is the progression of MS was reduced or stopped by the low saturated fat diet, and it was even effective for patients who had advanced MS disease. And so here is the result. In the first year, there was a 70% reduction in what's called exacerbations. These are MS flares. 5% per year after that, 95% total, and it remained that way for a total of 16 years. Swank reported that about 1 in 500 patients did not respond to dietary change. That means that 499 out of 500 patients, let's phrase it differently, are going to get better eating a whole foods, low-fat, plant-based diet. The odds are not that good for medication. I'll talk about that in a second. So here were his findings. 95% of the patients consuming a low-saturated fat diet remained normal or nearly or mildly disabled at the end of 30 years. Only 5% of those patients died. 80% of the patients consuming the high saturated fat diet died. 80% died in the high fat diet. Okay, so if you're an MS patient looking at this, what are you going to do? The results of the drugs are just awful. Dr. Swank published a lot of articles in medical journals, and other researchers have duplicated his work. One thing I want to let you know about that's kind of interesting, there was a thing that went on in England called the scheme. The National Health Service in the United Kingdom has had money problems for years. Sooner or later, you run out of money to treat all the sick people. And they noticed something interesting, which was that multiple sclerosis patients who declined medication seemed to be doing better than the ones that were medicated. So they went to the drug companies and they said, we'd like to propose paying you based on the efficacy rates of your drugs. You can be a little arrogant sometimes, and arrogance leads you to make very stupid decisions. So the drug companies agreed to do this. It was called the scheme. So what happened is that some patients continued to say no to drugs, and some patients were medicated with the drugs. And at the end of a certain period of time, they looked at it, and what had happened was the patients taking the drugs were far worse off than the ones who didn't. Now, these people weren't put on Swank's diet or McDougall's diet. These people were just sent home to live their life, probably eating terribly, and they were still better off than the patients taking the drugs. So the National Health Service said, I think that you owe us money, because now we have these very much sicker people we got to take care of. So not only did the drugs not help, but they made it worse, and you should pay. Well, the drug companies didn't like that, so this huge brouhaha started. Lots of articles published in the British Medical Journal. And in one of the most striking things I've ever read in my life, you'd laugh out loud if this topic wasn't so serious. And I remember the last sentence of this article. They're talking about this whole thing, and the head of the committee that started this said in the British Medical Journal, perhaps outcomes-based schemes should be avoided in the future. Okay, so when we take a look at what's going on, it's a big problem, so we should put our heads in the sand and keep medicating people because that's better. It can make you crazy. Okay, so diet and Alzheimer's disease. You know, we talked about this a little bit last night. Alzheimer's disease is geographically distributed. You don't see much of it in northern Africa and rural China and Okinawa. You see a lot of it in westernized countries. And I think this little paragraph is worth reading to you. And I wish I could tell you I could read all the way over as it gets a little darker on that side. But it says, mounting evidence from ecological and observational studies, as well as studies of mechanisms, indicates that the Western dietary pattern is strongly associated with the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease and several other chronic diseases. This is a recent article. I just reviewed this on video clips a few days ago. So it goes through all the mechanisms, okay? And that's one of the things, if you have a mechanism of action, that strengthens the study quite a bit. So anyway, this is recent, and these are authors that are saying, it's the food. You've heard that a few times here, yes? It's the food, right? It's the food that's causing the problem. Now, let's look at some factors. You know, I have 20 hours of slides on this, but let's just summarize here. Amyloid plaques contain metals. Amyloid plaques are the markers for Alzheimer's disease in the brain. And so there's a whole mechanism that causes that, and if you look at people who have mental decline in Alzheimer's disease, they have more plaques, and those plaques are filled with metals. A study of 1,451 people, those with lower copper levels had less cognitive decline than those with higher copper levels. The Chicago Health and Aging Project, with 9,000 participants, researchers recorded what they ate. People eating high copper diets have better loss or increased loss of memory. Those without memory problems took in less copper. Iron, same thing. People slowest on cognitive tests had the highest blood iron levels, all right? So where do the metals come from? Well, copper pipes and cast iron pans and multivitamins, all right? That's why I'm so cautious about supplements, is because people don't realize, particularly people who are eating animal foods-based diets, then they're taking multivitamins that have even more iron and copper and that sort of thing. Fortified foods. People eat an animal foods-based diet, and they take multivitamins, and they take other supplements, and then they eat fortified foods, which have been proven to act the same way in the body as taking isolated nutrients and pills. Liver. People eat liver, which I've always, even back when I was a terrible eater, I thought that was gross. I did everything else wrong, but I did not eat liver. Vegetables and beans contain non-heme iron. And here's the issue with non-heme iron that's found in plant foods, is that the body regulates non-heme iron. And when you need more iron, it absorbs more, and when you don't need more iron, it absorbs less. But heme iron is found in animal foods, and your body absorbs that no matter what. And so that's where these high metal levels are coming from. It's the food that's causing cognitive decline. So plant eaters have lower levels of metals, animal foods have higher levels of metals. This is simple, folks, all right? So you're gonna, and if you look at the RDAs, and I won't spend a lot of time reading this to you, but if you look at the RDAs and you start looking at somebody who's eating the standard American diet with a pretty good helping of fortified foods every day, in addition to all the garbage that they're eating from the animal foods, you'll see that they're exceeding the RDA for metals by sometimes dozens of times. Aluminum, there's no nutritional need for it. It's sometimes found in the water. It's also found in iodized salt. Okay? Yeah. That's a whole other story we could talk about. Iodized salt's probably one of the worst things that's happened to Western civilization. But researchers found a 50% higher incidence of Alzheimer's disease in parts of England where there's more aluminum in the water. Same observations in France and Canada. So it's one of the reasons we tell people to stay away from iodized salt. So where all do you get aluminum? Well, it's used as an emulsifying agent in cheese. Cheese is a high aluminum food. And people say, well, I just can't give up cheese. Well, I tell them about the estrogen levels in cheese, and then I tell them about the aluminum. And you'd be surprised how many people can give up cheese if you tell them the truth. We haven't even gotten to the pus cells yet. You notice that one of the problems is with these cows that are raised in these confinement facilities, we were discussing it last night, what happens is that they have infections all the time. And so you end up with a lot of white blood cells, pus cells in the milk, and you can have 700,000 pus cells per milliliter and it's considered safe. Yeah, so how about some pus cells and estrogen, a little bit of aluminum thrown in? Yum, give me some more of that. Baking powder, refined salt, creamers, creamers, foil, cookware, soda cans, and antacids. And we have people in this country who pop those like pills. In fact, the message, if you ever watch the commercials for these things, the message is that you take your proton pump inhibitor and then you go to the barbecue and eat fried chicken and french fries with your friends, right? You just keep doing the same things that you were doing before. So if you want to avoid metals, eat more plants, avoid fortified foods, eliminate cheese and dairy, choose safe cookware, avoid vitamins and supplements. Tap water is a problem. Choose high-quality teas. If you're going to drink actual tea, I'm not talking about herbal teas, but if you're going to drink like green tea, make sure it comes from a high-quality source. Exercise helps you to rid your body of excess iron, and donating blood lowers iron levels too. Mercury can harm the brain. It's concentrated in fish, and one of the problems, you heard me say this morning when you saw food choices, in the ocean, we have this phenomenon of things that eat things that eat things that eat things, and the mercury gets concentrated as you go up the food chain, and then we call that tuna. Okay? And again, people say, I couldn't give up tuna. Well, I don't know. How about a nice big plate full of mercury? Think about it that way. Really, it's a lot of how you frame this stuff in your head. We tell ourselves stories about food. What if we tell ourselves a different and true story about food instead of the story that's been advertised to us? We all like to think we're such smart and savvy consumers. I used to think I was too. I think probably the best comeuppance for me about, when you're younger and a little bit arrogant, you think you know everything, is when I was 38 years old and I found out about all this stuff and I found out I didn't know anything. It was a big leveling experience. I haven't forgotten it, actually, which is a good thing. So diet and Alzheimer's disease, what you see consistently is when you look at comparisons of the standard American diet, vegan diet, vegetarian diet, you see the vegetarians do best. Saturated fat, by the way, increases the risk because what it does is it amplifies the effect of metals. Well, where do you find saturated fat? You find it in the animal foods that have the high metal content, all right? So it's just a great recipe for inducing cognitive decline. And this is I've said for years, Alzheimer's disease may be one of the worst things that happens to anybody. Can't imagine having a basically healthy body and no mind, no ability to enjoy life. And you ruin the lives of the people around you who are charged with taking care of you. I've had people sitting in my office in tears because they've had to commit a family member to an institution, not because they wanted to, but because the family just could no longer take care of it anymore. All right? And so if you won't do it for yourself, I think that eating a terrible diet and letting yourself get sick is the ultimate act of selfishness. It really is. Because what you're basically saying is, I'm so narcissistic and interested in myself that I'm willing to inflict the consequences of my bad behavior on the taxpayers, on society, and on the family and friends closest to me, and it's unforgivable. Yeah. So, I always said that I was going to not turn into a curmudgeon until I turned 60. I just never made it that far. But I'm going to be 60 in a few weeks, so my age is catching up with my attitude, I suppose. Saturated fat, easy to consume. It only takes 25 grams of saturated fat to really increase your risk of Alzheimer's disease. So how much are we really talking about in terms of 25 grams of saturated fat? Well, here, if you eat an egg with bacon, a grilled cheese, a small serving of meat, there you go. I know people who eat more than that in one day. A glass of milk, a serving of salmon, and a couple pieces of cheese pizza. There you have it. Most people eat much more than that, and you'll consistently see the more saturated fat in the diet, the more Alzheimer's disease you get. Same thing here. Low saturated fat decrease the formation of beta amyloid plaque. High saturated fat diet increases the formation of amyloid beta plaque. This study is very interesting, and I'll tell you why. A study of 908 elderly New Yorkers, and they showed that those that ate the most calories and the most saturated fat more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. But the thing that's the most striking about this and several other studies is that the people who benefit most are the ones who have the genetic predisposition to develop Alzheimer's disease. There's a particular allele that puts you at high risk, and the worst one is the ApoE4, which results from both parents passing down genetic predisposition. And what we see in people who have this pesky allele is when they eat a better diet, their risk goes down more than people who don't have that particular allele. So you don't have to be a victim of your genetic predisposition, which is empowering, because I don't know about you guys, I did not get to pick my genes, but I get to pick what I'm having for dinner tonight. All right, that's where you get the power. Cholesterol and Alzheimer's disease. Okay, so fat, cholesterol, and trans fat cause the body to make more cholesterol, and that reduces blood flow. And then people who have higher cholesterol levels also have an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. Where's the cholesterol? It's in the same foods that contain the saturated fat and the metals that increase your risk. So what we have all packaged up is, if you eat these foods, is a perfect food for inducing disease. Heart attacks, you've heard a lot about that. Diabetes, just heard about that. Alzheimer's disease. So really, if you eat a terrible diet, it's not if something's going to happen, it's when and what it will be. It's every day you do it, you're increasing your risk that something bad is going to happen. Actually, I'm not proposing that this would be a good idea, but there have been some studies done showing that when you put early Alzheimer's patients on cholesterol-lowering meds, you get a little bit of improvement. It doesn't last very long. The better idea is to change the diet, lower the cholesterol and saturated fat, and really just get rid of the problem. So Alzheimer's disease is, yes, there's some genetic predisposition. No, it doesn't have to happen to you. You don't have to be a helpless victim of your genetic disposition. Okay, so it's difficult to convince people to eat a plant-based diet sometimes. It can be hard to get people to be compliant, hard to get doctors to recommend it. And the other thing we hear all the time is, gosh, we need more research. You guys hear that all the time? We need more research. And I would love to see more research. But the reality is, while we only have the type of research that everybody wants on a handful of diets, and here's what I mean by the type of research that everybody wants. Everybody likes Esselstyn-type data. You put a bunch of patients on a diet in 1985, and you follow them for 30 years, and then you bring along the next 198, you follow them for a long time, and the diet's specific, and you have good data on the patients, and at the end, you have all this wonderful news to report. Dr. McDougall's done this with multiple sclerosis, Neil Barnard's done it with diabetes, Dr. Swank did it with multiple sclerosis. So what everybody wants to see is, let's do a long-term study and show the same thing for other diseases. I'd love to see that too, but these types of studies are hard to fund. And the bottom line is that we don't have to wait that long, because the medical journals are full of clues in terms of research data about what type of diet people should be eating to prevent and reverse disease. So I want to talk a little bit about inflammatory bowel disease, and I'll tell you why I developed an interest in this, first of all. Well, let me tell you what it is. Let's define it first. It refers to bowel disorders. The most common ones that you hear about are Crohn's and colitis. The most common symptom is inflammation that develops throughout the gastrointestinal tract. It approximately affects 1.4 million people in the United States, costs $1.7 billion a year, and accounts for a lot of disability, doctor visits, surgeries, etc. The two major types are Crohn's disease. With Crohn's disease, the inflammation can develop anywhere in the gastrointestinal tract, from the mouth all the way through the body, down to the lower intestine and rectum. Ulcerative colitis affects the inner lining of the lower intestine. The symptoms are very similar for both. Pain, bloody, mucus-filled stools, diarrhea. It's not unusual to see these patients, even medicated, having 20 bloody bowel movements a day. They generally live having to know where the nearest restroom is, which restricts your activity a lot because, for example, if you want to go out hiking in the woods, That can be difficult, or canoeing, a lot of activities. A lot of the people that have come to our office for help have given up a lot of the things that they really like to do because of horseback riding. You don't get to do anything like that because the first thing you do is you get into a new place, you find out where the bathrooms are, and make sure you sit at the back of the theater so you can run out there 14 times during the movie. This is the way these people live. Both conditions usually run in cycles. They start out relapsing and remitting. At some point in time, they get worse. With age particularly, they get worse. And as you run through the repertoire of medications, eventually nothing works. And if you go to the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation's website, they don't say it exactly this way, but I'll give you my interpretation of it. If you have colitis, you're really lucky because you can get cured by taking out your colon. What a lucky thing that is. If only these people knew how lucky they were. Apparently they just don't understand their good fortune when they're having the colon taken out. I mean, come on. Whereas colitis, you can't take out the whole gastrointestinal tract, so you're going to end up with symptoms no matter what you do. So how I got interested in this, and you can see the complications here, they're miserable. Absolutely miserable. These patients have no quality of life by the time this is finished. So how I got interested in this is that a woman came to me about 16 years ago. She'd done some contract work for our company, and she had Crohn's disease. She said, "You don't know this about me, but I've had Crohn's for 20 years. I spend 6 or 7 weeks a year in the hospital. Right now," she said, "I'm taking Remicade, and I have a lump in my breast, I have a spot on my lung and an abnormal pap test, and I don't know if the Crohn's is going to kill me or the Remicade's going to kill me." That's what she was taking. "But I have to do something because I certainly can't go on this way." I said, "Well, I didn't learn much about Crohn's and colitis. I mean, I learned about what it was in school, but certainly not anything that would change your life. But let me start doing some research." And this was my first venture into doing my own research. Let's see what's out there. I mean, maybe there is nothing out there, but maybe there is something. And so I started doing research, and over the last 16 years, I've archived 2,000 studies on my server showing the connection between diet and Crohn's and colitis. And I'll come back to my person who contacted me back then. So let's talk about causes. The incidence of Crohn's disease is higher in urban areas than rural areas. Why is that? The diets are different there. Patients with Crohn's disease eat more sugar, refined carbohydrates, more omega-6 fatty acids, which are found in polyunsaturated oils and animal foods, less fruit and vegetables. They improve on exclusion and elemental diets, and then they get worse when they go off of those diets. Elemental diet is basically vitamin-fortified water. And I started looking at that thinking, is it vitamin-fortified water that's making them better, or is it what they're not eating during that period of time? That became a very important clue. Dietary causes, diet and lifestyle are the likely causes. When people move from an area of low IBD incidence to an area of high IBD incidence, you see an increase in risk. Diet high in meats and fatty foods, desserts has been associated with a higher incidence of Crohn's disease in children. Refined foods increases the risk of Crohn's, and you see, and so you look at the number of studies. I'm just giving you a smattering here, but you notice I'm pretty careful to put research on my slides, and I think that as you start to become more discerning consumers of health information, when people just show you stuff, like we were talking last night, making up stories, this isn't about somebody. I'm going to tell you the story of what happened to this woman in a minute here, but the background on the situation isn't the story, it's the science that backs up the mechanism for the story that I'm going to share with you, and that's very important. High intake of meat, protein, sulfur. Where do you find the sulfur? It's in the animal foods. Alcohol intake cause relapse for UC patients. Animal foods, particularly dairy products and eggs, are high in sulfur, and they aggravate the lining of the intestine, leading to increased risk of disease. Crohn's is more prominent in areas, or more prevalent in areas of the world where dairy intake is higher. When dairy is removed from the diet of UC patients, they get better. When it's reintroduced, every single patient suffers relapse. In one study, an analysis of this study estimated that based on the average relapse rates for Crohn's patients, the odds that these relapses in response to bringing milk back into the diet were greater than 1,000 to 1. Okay, it was clearly the milk. You feed them milk, they get worse. You take it away, and they get better. So do you see? We don't have Esselstyn data, but are we starting to get a picture of what these people should not eat? Yeah, I think so. One study concluded that ulcerative colitis patients might actually have an allergy to milk. And researchers reported a highly significant association between circulating antibodies to cow's milk, similar to what we see in the type 1 diabetics that we were talking about earlier. A review of 19 studies, 2,500 patients with IBD, and you see the same story. Animal foods, fat, dairy, increased risk. Not as many vegetables, fruits, whole foods, increased risk. The study in Japan looked at the relationship between dietary changes and Crohn's and colitis, and what they found is increased intake of total fat, animal fat, polyunsaturated fat. You know, everybody has this idea that there are better fats. I'll tell you, there's only one thing, it's called low fat. That is protective. The strongest independent dietary factor, however, was animal protein. So much for eating lower fat animal foods. Second most important factor was polyunsaturated fat. Worse than saturated fat. Patients who eat less fiber, less raw fruits and vegetables, and more refined sugar have an increased risk of Crohn's disease. A study of Canadian children, same thing. Poor diet leads to increased risk. And you see the same thing again and again and again. The gut microbiome, very interesting new field of study. I mean, 90% of the articles on the gut microbiome in the medical journals were written in the last 20 years or so, 25 years. What happens is diet affects the gut microbiome. When you eat a diet high in animal foods, dairy products, low in fiber, high in fat, and then you get all the diseases associated with doing that, starting in childhood where you're taking a lot of antibiotics for sinus infections and ear infections and that sort of thing, you destroy your gut microbiome. And that's a risk factor for developing UC and Crohn's. So I'm showing you a smattering, but anyway, a clear picture was starting to emerge. And so I said to this woman, you know, I don't know exactly what I'm doing, but enough to start experimenting with you. And so the goals were, when we started this, to reduce inflammation, heal the damaged tissue, restore the gut microbiome, and reduce or eliminate medications. And so what happened with her, and then I'll tell you how we did it, is we started experimenting with ideas, and within a few months, she had a great gastroenterologist, by the way, who said, listen, you're not getting better, you're getting worse. And I'm interested in trying anything that would help you. So he took her off her meds and said, let's see what happens. That was 16 years ago, and she is still a former Crohn's patient. Okay. In fact, our members have fun with that. You know, they'll say, I used to have Crohn's, I used to have colitis, and people say, what do you mean you used to have it? Well, I don't have it anymore. I mean, you get rid of it, right? All right, so anyway, that's what we did, and she's maintained her state of remission for 16 years from the point that we started. Remember, on Remicade, not working, lump in the breast, abnormal pap test, and spot on her lung. All right, and by the way, she's like the healthiest person you know. She's another one whose IQ is higher than her cholesterol. So, what you want next is you want the universe to send you lots of people who have this condition so you can refine your protocol, which is what happened, actually. The one thing you'll learn about me over time, I am the luckiest human you will ever meet on the planet, really, truly. And some people, when they come to work at Wellness from Health, some of the staff will tell them, you never saw anything like what happens to Pam Popper, because when she puts something out there, it always happens. And they'll go, yeah, right. And usually about 6 months later, they'll come in and they'll go, you really are like the luckiest person I know. So anyway, we got a lot of people who decided to contact us, and we got a chance to practice the protocol. And so here's the thing that we do. You know, I mentioned earlier that I didn't think fortified vitamin water was really helping the patients as much as what they were taking out of the diet. So I thought, well, what if we fed people who have IBD a plant-based diet, and we chose really low protein, low fat foods that very seldom cause reactions in anybody. And one of the things that we wanted to include was brown rice because it's known to clean up diarrhea, which all these patients have. So we started feeding them potatoes, brown rice, and they can only have 4 vegetables: green peas, carrots, celery, and green beans, and they have to be cooked so that they melt in your mouth. All right, so if the green beans don't dissolve on your tongue, they're not well cooked enough. This is opposite of the advice you give to other people. Wild-caught salmon or organic animal food a couple times a week, and sometimes that surprises people. But one thing you have to recognize when we talk about these folks is that these are people who haven't been able to absorb nutrients from food for years, and they're often painfully underweight. Painfully. I mean, I've had men 5 feet 9, 5 feet 10 inches tall who weighed 120 pounds. And so this is not a time to worry about where calories come from as long as we keep it in safe range. So that's why that's there. Small amounts of gluten-free pasta, a little bit of tofu, rice cakes. Salt is the only condiment, water is the only beverage, 5 to 6 meals a day. And you do this until you're having 3 to 4 well-formed bowel movements without blood a day. It usually takes 4 to 6 weeks at the outside. And we have letters we give to them to take back to their gastroenterologist to take them off the drugs and that sort of thing. And the GI docs are great. They're really great about it. They understand. We have a referenced booklet that they can take too, so the GI doc can see all the research. And generally speaking, they're really cooperative. Absolutely no dairy, no high gluten foods like barley, rye, oats, and wheat, no oil, no raw vegetables, no supplements, no juice, no refined foods, no beans, no grains, no condiments other than salt, nothing else to drink except water. And they always say, well, can I have this? And can I have that? I said, if it's not on this list over here, you don't get it. And you're going to be very happy with Dr. Pam in 4 to 6 weeks, very unhappy the first few weeks, thinking if I have to eat another cup of brown rice and another sweet potato, I'm going to throw myself off a bridge, but trust me, you're going to thank me in a little bit, because it works. All right. And then, of course, we tell them to eliminate any food that causes a reaction immediately. So once we get them stable, the next thing is to start a low-dose probiotic. And then once they're stable on that phase 1 diet and a low-dose probiotic, we start introducing new foods until we get them to the place where they're stable. Maintenance is no barley, rye, oats, or wheat, brow foods, no dairy. They have to be low-fat and really can't have a lot of junk food. These are people that have some difficulty, and they stay on probiotics for the rest of their life. And so where's the evidence to support this? Again, I could show you hundreds of these types of studies, but you look at a study with patients who ate an unrefined, high-fiber carbohydrate diet, 10 patients assigned to exclude foods to which they were intolerant. And what you see is the exclusion diet resulted in more patients getting better. But the reason is because, and this is where a lot of people get frustrated, they adopt a plant-based diet when they have Crohn's or colitis, but they continue to have symptoms. And one of the reasons is because if you continue to eat those brow foods and you don't use probiotics and you don't stop the inflammation and all that sort of thing, the simple conversion to a plant-based diet will not work. It has to be phased in this very specific way. But the point is that the exclusion diet was very, very effective. 33 patients with Crohn's, 29 identified food intolerances, and 21 of them remained in remission for 15.2 months. And by the way, 16 years of remission, which is our longest. When you're dealing with drugs, you're lucky. I mean, people are ecstatic when a drug places people in remission for a few years, a couple years, 5 years maybe, and we're talking 16. And the most common intolerances, dairy and wheat, okay? 32 patients with Crohn's, placed on an unrefined high-fiber carbohydrate diet, followed for 4.4 years, compared with 32 matched controls. The diet group, 111 days in the hospital versus 533 for the controls, 1 surgery in the diet group, 5 in the controls. Again, we start to see those really stark differences that you see. And these people weren't on our diet. These were people just on better diet, okay? We don't see 111 days in the hospital versus 553. We see 0 days in the hospital and 0 surgeries, all right? Relapse rates for UC patients are highest in patients who, let me step down a little bit, who ate more meat, protein, consumed the most alcohol. Fat reduction is really beneficial for Crohn's patients. Study showed that low-fat diet resulted in significant reduction in the amount of water and sodium excreted with bowel movements. 10 out of 13 patients began having solid bowel movements. And again, these people aren't eating our diet, they're just eating a better diet. Think what happens with an optimal diet. Again, we see studies, here you see how many are listed, studies showing that gluten restriction works. So I'd love it if somebody would do an Esselstyn study on IBD, but we don't have to wait for that. That's the point. And you guys come up with any disease you want, and we start looking in the medical literature, and I promise you, you will find this type of data for acne, for arthritis, for osteoarthritis, for migraine headaches, for diabetic neuropathy. Pick a disease, you see the same thing. We have enough research. Exclusion diets that involve excluding gluten and dairy, same thing. Dairy, frequency of bowel movements, status of health decreases, or increasing numbers of bowel movements, status of health decreases with dairy. Diet versus drugs, the diet works better. And remember, they weren't using a diet like mine. Probiotics, evidence shows probiotics help Crohn's and colitis patients. So, in other words, and I'm showing you a smattering. I mean, really, we would have to be here until Monday for me to go through a fraction of the stuff we could talk about. I mean, we could spend the next 2 hours talking just about probiotics and Crohn's and colitis, but the reason I'm showing you this is because I want you to know that this is not something I dreamed about one night, and woke up and said, let's try this. This isn't some type of storytelling going on. There's a lot of evidence to document every little thing I showed you, the reason why we use certain foods, the reason why we introduce foods in a certain order, the reason why we introduce probiotics at a specific point in time. We have research to show that. Now, I am going to have to step down here to read this. This is a woman who allowed me to use her name. This is before dietary intervention. And she says, quote, "Even though I was on medication for Crohn's disease, I still had frequent symptoms at 30 years of age. This disease seemed to have taken over my life. I found myself not doing things I once enjoyed. My life revolved around the restroom. When I went somewhere with my kids, they would see one and tell me where it was in case I needed it. I stopped making plans with friends. As a single parent, I was afraid of losing my job because all of the frequent restroom trips I was having to make." And I just took 2 paragraphs from her story. But this is a few weeks after. Weeks, not years. "Living my life now has become more worry-free. I can make plans with friends and family and go places with my kids. It's nice to not worry about where the closest restroom is or even if I'll make it on time. A great example of change, I used to love riding on the back of my friend's motorcycle, but when the Crohn's took over my life, I was afraid to ride anymore. I even sold all my riding clothes because I thought I would never be able to ride again. But now I date somebody who rides and I'm always going on trips with him. Crohn's disease no longer controls my life." And that particular person adopted this diet in 2012, still symptom-free, in remission. And that's what we see time and time again. You do not get this with drugs. You do not get this response with drugs. So the bottom line, and I wanted to make sure we left some time for questions, which we'll take next, but the cause of most common degenerative diseases is diet. An optimal diet's the best way to prevent, stop, reverse disease. The medical journals contain thousands of articles. You just have to have enough curiosity to look for them. And I get a lot of interns in my office. I'm blessed with interns these days. They come from Europe, they come from all over. I had a woman from Berlin with us for 4 months this year, medical students, dietetic students, nurses. And when they come in, it's an experience. They always say at the end, I've never had any experience like this. But I always tell them, if you're going to be a good clinician, whatever specialty, you're going to be a medical doctor, dietitian, whatever. If you're going to be a good clinician, it's going to be because you develop something called the curiosity gene, where you start tracking down information, you start getting geeked up about finding this stuff. And what we see with interns, the first couple weeks they're there, they act like they've been inducted into slavery. They sit at the computer. Of course, we feed everybody really well at my office, but you can just see it's sort of like drudgery till you get the hang of it. And then invariably what happens, and you can see their faces light up. I just had one in the office the other day who had really struggled with this, and he said, "I think I know what you mean now." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "I start digging into this material. I don't want to eat. I don't want to go to the bathroom. I want to cancel dinner with my friends. All I want to do is I just want to sit here and find more stuff." I said, "You are going to be a great doctor because you have the curiosity gene. That's the key to all this. So it's all there. And yes, I think we need to do more research. I think there's always room for more research, and there's so much stuff we don't know. So I hope at some point in time I'll be able to participate in helping to make that happen, particularly on Crohn's and colitis, which are my areas of interest. But there is so much there. There is absolutely no reason for a doctor to avoid putting somebody on a plant-based diet because they think, not enough research yet. We have enough. So with that, I'd be happy to take our remaining few minutes here and take any questions you might like to ask. And so we have a microphone, so we make sure all the people in our remote audience get a chance to hear the questions. So anybody?
Hi, it's me again.
Hi. Hello, me again.
I had two pretty specific questions. They're not related at all. The first one is with the aluminum.
Mm-hmm.
I can't tell if I'm being paranoid or not, but I hear all this stuff about the deodorant and then it can get in your lymph nodes and all that. And then the second question was the probiotics. And I was wondering, which ones are you recommending? Because if the yogurt and all that's linked to dairy, then...
Yeah, let's start with that one. We'll work our way back. Yogurt is not a good source of probiotics. There's not enough in there to make a difference. And in fact, a lot of the yogurt companies that have made claims about that have been sued, and they lost those lawsuits. So that's not a source. You need a really strong probiotic product. And which one somebody should take depends upon their state of health, their age, what you're trying to solve. And so I discourage people from going into stores and buying them. Another reason to avoid buying them in stores is that they degrade over time. And it's nobody's fault. It's the distribution system in a store that causes a lot of time between when they leave the factory and when they end up in somebody's hands. And so best to get them from a provider who knows what they're doing, who's buying them directly from a company and can tell you, this is the product I think you ought to take. And so that's not one size fits all kind of thing. In reference to your question about aluminum, I also have some concerns about deodorants and well, you don't have a problem with deodorants, the antiperspirant. Having said that, there are some times when you just can't avoid it, all right? And so I'm pretty judicious about when I use antiperspirants, but it's not an option for me to ruin. You know, I've tried to buy expensive clothes, and because I'm not going to get fatter, I can wear them till I die. That's one of the good things about eating this diet. Your wardrobe is very stable, you know. So anyway, I can't afford to ruin a suit. I can't afford to be on a stage in front of 5,000 people and, you know, have perspiration coming through. So I do use deodorants in those situations, but try not to. You know, on a day, when we're in a refrigerated environment like here, those of you watching out there, just so you know, it's like a meat locker in here, all right? And I'm going to go back to my room and put on my pajamas with feet as soon as this is over. But but anyway, when you're not in an environment like this, you have to sometimes use deodorant or antiperspirant rather.
When people come to you, do they have to previously been evaluated by a medical doctor, or can you be the first stop?
I'm not the first stop.
Okay.
And here's the thing: the most people that come to me or to somebody like me, they know what's wrong. And they're specifically looking for a different solution. And if they come to me and they don't know what's wrong, I send people to medical doctors, and I'm crystal clear that you should never discontinue your relationship with a medical doctor. Now, you might decide that the doctor you're seeing isn't such a good person and you want to change, but you should maintain a relationship with your doctor. And in fact, I've told many people that having a discussion, like the types of discussions our folks will have with their doctors, is a good litmus test to see if this is the doc who you want to continue to see. And sometimes people they're pleasantly surprised. I just heard from somebody this morning who I was speaking with really early this morning on the phone. She said that she went to see her doctor about changing. She wanted to swap out a med. She's on a bad med. She wanted to take a different med, and she eventually wants to get off the medications. And so she said when she went in to see her doctor, she had a lot of information, and she said the woman said the most amazing thing. She says, nobody ever wants to talk to me about this stuff. This is great. And so, sometimes you get that response. This is an amazing doc. You're going to stick with this one. She's fabulous, right? If the doc isn't receptive, then this is probably a sign you should go find another one, because God forbid if something happened and you needed a doctor, you want somebody who's on your side, right? So, and I said last night, this is true, one of the ways we can make sure the good doctors prosper and the bad ones go out of business is spread the word when you find one of these docs. And I told this gal this morning. I said, tell everybody you know about this amazing medical doctor you're seeing. Get all your friends to go to her too. Let's build her practice so, she can't leave the building at night to go home and dry up the business for the people around her who are still not on board. So, yeah. Yes.
Hi, the topic is cannabis. I'm doing my research in cannabis. I just like saying that. So I went to a cannabis conference recently, and there was a panel of professional football players, hockey players, professional athletes, and they were using a lot of opiates due to being in a lot of pain, and they got off of it by using cannabis. So as far as we have millions of people in this country using antidepressant drugs, and they have terrible side effects, do you ever suggest cannabis and its use in cancer and tumors? There's a lot of new science that goes to tell about how it reduces tumors and its anti-cancer properties.
Well, let me, this is a topic I have some very strong feelings about because of my experience. First of all, I'm all for the legalization of cannabis for medical purposes. We just passed that law in Ohio, and I was all for it. However, we have the same potential for abuse as we have with every other substance used in medical treatment. I have seen people who have been inappropriately prescribed cannabis. It has ruined their life because they should never have been taking it. And I think the idea that people in pain taking cannabis instead of opiates, you get rid of the pain. One of our business partners is a physical therapist near Albany, New York. Her name is Eileen Kopsaftis, and she's the best physical therapist in the country. And she's so good that we brought her on board as a partner. She's created a 300-hour certification course that'll be offered through our school next year to train people how to do physical therapy like she does. Now, let me give you an example of what this woman's capable of doing. We had a yoga student in her 70s who was going to have hip replacement surgery. Very strong-willed woman, and I brought her in my office one day and I said, you and I don't see eye to eye on everything, but before you have this hip replacement surgery, I want you to talk to my friend Eileen, my colleague Eileen. And I said, if I have to, I'm going to lock you in my basement, not let you out until you have this conversation, because I feel that strongly about it. And she knew I was only half kidding. So I've threatened to do that. I used to threaten to do that to my mom, by the way. I said, Dad, I'm thinking of kidnapping her and putting her in the basement and feeding her beans and rice until she comes around to thinking differently, but it's against the law. And he looked me right in the eye. He said, I won't tell a soul. So anyway, but this woman had a couple of phone conferences with my colleague Eileen, who told her what to start doing, which she did, and she canceled that hip replacement surgery. Subsequently moved to Hawaii, where you live as an outdoors person all the time. She came bounding in the office about 1.5 years ago when she was visiting Columbus to see friends. She saw some friends and family in Columbus, still has not had a hip replacement surgery. And when you can get those kinds of results, you don't replace one drug with another. It's just the same thing is going on in every medical specialty, you guys, as better options are available. And we have a tendency to think that if we substitute a dangerous thing for a less dangerous thing, this is better. But the objective of healthcare is not to hurt people less than somebody else is hurting them. That is not what it's all about. It's to get people to health. And the strategies are available. They're just not being promoted to people.
As far as the cannabis is concerned, the CBD doesn't have the THC content, so it's not for people necessarily to get high.
It doesn't matter. I'm not talking about getting high. That's a separate problem. But I'm talking about the objective of healthcare should not be to find ways to hurt people less. The discussion should be about setting the bar higher. And I said this last night. We have the collision of low expectations in the doctor's office. The patient doesn't think that he or she will get well. The doctor nurse practitioner, whoever, doesn't know how to make the patient well. And with those low expectations on both ends, it is not surprising that most people in this country are sick or on their way to getting sick, and we simply have got to set the bar higher. People can enjoy much better health. The problem with setting the bar higher, and I didn't say this last night, but I'll say it here, we have a problem with medical institutions adopting this, and that's why it's a consumer-driven movement. If you are a medical institution and you let somebody like me into your medical institution, if I get my way, you're going to go into a slow process of liquidation. You're going to close a facility every 6 weeks, because when you start putting the information in front of consumers, given all the information, their demand and desire for a lot of this treatment goes away. So the institutions, the people who promote this crap, are never going to give it up. There's too much money in it. They can't tell the truth. They will lose their jobs. So it's got to come from outside. That's why we think we're in a great position to do it. We're building a healthcare company outside the system with nobody's rules but our own. In case you guys haven't figured out, I sometimes don't do well with other people's rules, so I go someplace and make up my own. But this is the only way to solve this problem and show consumers how to just say no. That's one of the things I tell people. You've got to learn to just say no to a great deal of what's put in front of you. So, yes?
You talked about the cookware, the metals in cookware. What's the best type of cookware to use?
Stainless steel and glass are good. That's what I use. And by the way, iron skillets are not a problem for people who don't eat all that heme iron. The problem is the cumulative effect. So a treated iron skillet is a great resource to have. My grandma had one, and I remember many good things that she made. You know, she was a European cook, and the food wasn't all that high in fat. We ate out of the garden a lot. But the iron skillet is actually not a problem when you get rid of all of these other sources of iron, like the beef, the animal foods. So.
Is porcelain okay?
Porcelain's okay, yes. Yeah, porcelain's okay, for sure. Yeah. And then, yeah. Well, we'll get both. We're not finished. Yeah, go on ahead.
Enzymes? What do you think of enzymes? Because I know I have some issues with some of the irritable bowel stuff too, related to autoimmune illness, and enzymes is one of the big things that they put out there too. And I don't want to do all these supplements, but if you saw my house, you'd probably cringe, because there's got to be hundreds of supplement bottles trying to get better.
Well, digestive enzymes are not, I mean, if you have chronic pancreatitis or pancreatic cancer or cystic fibrosis, pancreatic enzymes are a good idea. Digestive enzymes are a good idea. Other than that, you don't need them. So that's that holistic pharmacist approach. People say, well, I feel better. And don't confuse feeling better with getting better. And remember those Vioxx patients, they all felt better instantaneously, COX-2 inhibitor. Dr. David Graham testified in front of Senator Grassley's committee, and when asked how many people Vioxx killed, this is the FDA's representative. He said someplace between 58,000 and 120,000 people. They felt better, but they sure were not getting better. So don't confuse those two things. So my guess is that if you're taking some type of digestive enzymes, you're not addressing the problem.
How about naturally occurring metals that we're going to get in the produce, like that comes from the soil? So how do we? Is there a way to deflect?
I don't think that we have any evidence to. Well, let me say this, and this is just a general statement. I am vociferously opposed to the way that we farm in this country and many countries. Let's forget about the animal farming. Let's talk about farming in general. Having said that. I think we should do something about it, mainly for environmental purposes. But we talked about this a little bit yesterday, this idea that the food is contaminated, the food is deficient. It's just not borne out by the evidence. Okay, I mean, studies are being published right now. Look at the one that I showed you it's 2 weeks old, that Alzheimer's disease study. Right now, showing that when people eat better diets full of fruits and vegetables and potatoes and all the stuff grown in the contaminated, deficient soil, they get better. Okay, so I'm not saying it's not a problem. I'm saying it's a distraction. People get tied up with distractions, and that's one of the things that aggravates me a lot. And a lot of the quackery that goes on out there is a distraction. People come in, and this is the type of stuff people are told they have subclinical thyroid disease, can't find it in a blood test, and they're told they have heavy metal toxicity, systemic candida, soy allergy, wheat allergy, undiagnosable Lyme disease. What are some of the other things? And allergy to latex, all these crazy things that people are told that they have. And you know what they have? Bad diet. Too fat. Need to lose weight. Sedentary lifestyle. And they spend enormous amounts of money on this quackery that these people who diagnose people with this stuff sell, and they don't get any better. That's it, and I'm not saying that people don't have heavy metal toxicity. Some people do, but not the numbers of people who are being told that. And again, I certainly don't want you to think I'm not concerned about the environment, but if you're my specialty is human health. And the reason why people have type 2 diabetes isn't because of metals in the soil. It's fat in the diet. It's fat in the diet. It's the food. Yeah.
With the heavy metals, I hear cilantro, blended in with foods gets out some of the mercury. Is there anything else that may remove metals from the head in a natural plant-based
and
diet?
Cilantro doesn't work either. This is the reductionist approach to health. Please give me a magical food that will solve a problem. Okay, and here's what that leads to. Is people coming into my office, remember when we talked about the combination lock theory last night? People coming into my office, they do a little bit of this and a little bit of that. They're responding to the latest headline. And magazines like Prevention Magazine and some of those really promote this. So people read an article and it says, blueberries reduces your risk of cancer. So they eat blueberries for 6 days and nothing changes. And then they read an article that says soy will kill you, and then they take the soy out of their diet, and now they're still fat and sick. And then they read another article that says all you got to do is eat celery 8 times a day. So they're eating celery in the car and when they're going to bed at night, and they're still fat and sick because there are no magical foods or nutrients. It's the dietary pattern that you have to get right. And then people write to me every day and say, what food should I eat that's a good source of this or that nutrient? And I write back a whole foods, low-fat, plant-based diet. What food should I eat so I get enough? A whole foods, low-fat, plant-based diet. What food should I eat so I get this? A whole foods, low-fat, plant-based diet. Okay, I mean, it's automatic, just send that. That's it. It's the dietary pattern that you have to get right.
Would that remove the metals from the head?
You don't have to remove the metals from the head. Okay, that's the, and let's not get into specific discussions of specific disease states, because if you come to me with stomach cancer, and we start looking at evidence for treating stomach cancer, that's considerably different than a person who has diabetes, for example, and the diseases that we've been talking about here. Let's talk more in general terms here. Yes, did you have a question?
I thought you'd be, is this on? Yeah.
I'll repeat the question if you want.
Okay. Well, I thought you'd be pleased to know that I attended a conference 2 weeks ago for the national parks, the state parks and recreation, and a doctor that's at the Children's Research Hospital. She is an eye, ear, nose, and throat doctor, and she was examining these kids, and they kept coming back with medications and more medications. And finally, she looked at them and she thought, this medicine's not working. They're just keeping getting worse. And she finally said, what do you eat?
Yeah. It's catching on. It's catching on, and it's going to get better. I'm confident of that. So,
If someone wants to have a consultation with you, do they have to go to your office, or do you do phone consults?
I do phone.
Do they have to be referred by a doctor, or can they just contact
No,
you?
don't have to be referred by a doctor. Nope. Any other questions? Oh, okay.
Are there any consequences to raising a vegan child if they choose later to eat animal products?
Consequences to raising a vegan child. They're going to be leaner, smarter, more athletic, no sinus infections. There's some great side effects to raising a vegan child. No, I don't think, and I think it's probably fair to say that most children will experiment. I mean, let's face it, kids experiment around with everything as soon as they get a chance. I did that too in a lot of ways. But it's interesting because kids that are brought up with certain value systems usually return to those value systems after they're finished experimenting. And I've seen that with many kids who've grown up in a plant-based or vegan household. They circle back around and after a little of experimenting. So, but there's nothing harmful about it other than if they would stick with that, eating a lot of animal food for 25 years, they would, of course, have the same consequences as anybody else who eats an animal foods-based diet for 25 years. But if you're bringing up your children in a plant-based household, you're doing them a great favor. A great favor. Yeah, and kids can be taught to really appreciate this at a young age. I'll share a story with you. A woman in my office who's been there a long time, when she first became a member, right before she went to work for us, her daughter was in like the 3rd grade. And so this woman got a call from the teacher. You'd love getting a call at home at night about your kid from the teacher, right? She goes, "We had a little incident in class today." She's going, "Oh my gosh," And it was your daughter. She said, "I was talking about the food pyramid, and I asked if somebody could draw a food pyramid. And your daughter raised her hand and came up, and she drew a food pyramid, but it's nothing like the food pyramid." This was years and years ago when the USDA used a food pyramid. And so it was nothing like the food pyramid. So I told her that it was wrong, and she stood there and said, no, she was right about this, absolutely. And I told her that it didn't contain any dairy products, and she said that humans should not eat dairy products. And when I challenged her on it, she said that I should read a book called The China Study or something like that by Dr. T. Colin Campbell. And by the way, my mom works for a woman who's a personal friend of T. Colin Campbell. She has talked to him on the phone. So, 3rd grade, okay. So the other kids started asking questions of the little girl, "What do you know about diet?" and the whole 9 yards. So Kelly's thinking, my kid's in trouble. And instead, what she said is, "We were wondering if you could get your famous boss to come to our office or to our classroom and talk to the kids about nutrition." And so that's what we did. And my business partner, Chef Del Schroff, made healthy wraps and treats for the kids so we could show them what a plant-based meal would be like and all that sort of thing. And we were talking to the 2 3rd grade classes about eating better, eating a plant-based diet. And they were so interested. And so think about an 8-year-old kid who knows enough about this to stand up, have the courage of her convictions, and tell her classmates, "You don't need to eat dairy. You should read the China Study." And one other thing I'll share with you, because it's just a cute story. I've gone into a lot of classrooms over the years, and I'll never forget, this was another 3rd grade class. And one of the ways that we've always shown kids how to look at diet is by using diagrams that show the differences in food in different cultures, because sometimes you upset parents if you say something about dairy or whatever, so it's easier to let the kids arrive at their own conclusions. So you show them a typical traditional Chinese eating plan and ask them what's different. There's no dairy, so where the Chinese people get their calcium, it comes from plant foods, all that sort of thing. It works really great. The kids love it. So I was asking we had gone through the Chinese food pagoda, of the traditional Chinese food pagoda, and I said, let me ask you a question. Do you think the Chinese are healthier or the Americans are healthier? And this little boy in the front row raises his hands. I said, "What do you think?" He says, "Definitely Americans are healthier than Chinese." I said, "Well, why do you say that?" And he says, "They're communists over there." I said, "Well, yes, they are." But actually, some of the communists are eating better than Americans. So it's fun when you get kids involved in this discussion, and they're very much more interested in this than I think a lot of adults give them credit for. So I think they're giving me the sign that my time is up. Thank you so very much. It's been my pleasure.